Hello! Plague Von Karma here with another video. Today I want to talk about a childhood favourite franchise of mine. No Heroes Allowed. No, not No More Heroes. No Heroes Allowed. You may better know these as the Badman games. No Heroes Allowed began as a PSP title called Holy Invasion of Privacy, Badman! What did I do to deserve this? Before being struck for copyright and changing to What did I do to deserve this, my lord? Mouthful titles? Absolutely. And I'm almost sure that this is why many of you haven't heard of this franchise ever. Good thing they changed the name. Anyway, I've been into them since around 2012, where I browsed the PlayStation Store and wanted something cheap. And I've since come back to them on and off, with my love for the franchise increasing with each look-see. In this series, you are a god of destruction summoned to the game's world by the aptly named overlord Badman. In summoning you, Badman becomes weak and feeble, and thus it is on you to raise an army to protect him from the heroes that are trying to save the world. Once they are defeated, Badman comes to the surface to spread his influence. Every game follows the same core premise. As you would imagine by the title, this series is very tongue-in-cheek, featuring a lot of meta-humor targeted at the average wisecracking netizen. You may be surprised to hear that this franchise is made by NIS America, the people who make Disgaea, which does explain the comedy actually. In the first game, you dig a dungeon while maintaining an ecosystem for monsters to proliferate, which spawn when you break walls before multiplying on their own. After a set period of time, a hero enters and tries to conquer the dungeon you made, and if you build an effective one, perishes inside. You cannot influence the actions your monsters take. Instead, you have to build your dungeon around their habits and needs. If you don't, they'll die of starvation, overpredation, or simply be too weak to contest the heroes. I adore this gameplay loop, and it makes for a strong push and pull, having a shocking amount of depth, making no two playthroughs the same. The initial layout of each level is different, so you have to start building a dungeon and, go from there. The decision tree changes massively depending on how the nutrients initially distribute. It's really interesting. You can swap the heroes as slime bosses, go for a fundamentalist approach by building a lizardman colony, or get lucky with a rare monster from a treasure chest and build your playthrough around that instead. As you defeat heroes, you also get access to a whole other category of mana-based monsters, which are difficult to farm but very strong. So now instead of these, you can spawn a fleet of dragons and watch heroes evaporate before your eyes. You have to manage your resource distribution very carefully, or it can all just come crashing down. You don't want the bottom of the food chain to die off after all. You'll never know if it's just right until the hero comes around, but if they smash through your army, it never really feels unfair. It always feels like you could have done something better. Hell, there's even amazingly deep lore provided by the Almanac, plus tutorials that have small story elements, letting you see an intricate world forming behind the scenes. I really love these little tidbits. Even the heroes get their own entries and lore. These games are just oozing with passion, and it's all optional to look at. The best part? These games are tough as nails. You really have to grasp the core gameplay to get through them. Like, the final bosses are just plain brutal. In Japan, where this franchise is grouped under the Yusha or Yu-Nama labels, rather than having an identity crisis, the No Heroes Allowed franchise became a cult classic, with a surprisingly large community backing it up. This wasn't enough for it to get a selection of sequels over its decade-long existence. What Did I Do to Deserve This, My Lord 2 added a mutation element, where monsters change species based on what happens in the dungeon, as well as a whole continent with many stages to go through. No Heroes Allowed, the third title and what has since become the name of the franchise in general, introduced aquatic monsters to allow for a slew of different strategies, as well as an IQ mechanic where monsters can engage in special behaviours depending on how you maintain the water areas, allowing for you to gain an advantage. However, you can ignore both of these mechanics if you want. They're not mandatory at all in No Heroes Allowed. I adored both of these titles. They added even more depth to an already interesting game, but not in a way that made the original redundant. You can still go back to the old one, and not really feel like anything's missing. It all feels very self-contained. But after No Heroes Allowed, things got weird. They never revisited this gameplay style again. Following a mobile port of the first game for an old phone that appears to be lost media, and a couple of spin-offs, No Heroes Allowed took the form of a puzzle game with the release of Yu-Nama the Puzzle, released in 2012 exclusively for PlayStation Mobile, and followed up with No Heroes Allowed No Puzzles Either for the Vita and Android devices in 2014. Instead of intricate dungeon building, these are sliding puzzle games where you match monsters with long combos to kill heroes instead. The former title is a neat, albeit slightly repetitive title, while the latter was the start of a trend. No Puzzles Either was a mobile game through and through, being free but inundated with in-app purchases. While some would describe what was offered as generous by today's standards, that's more of a sign of the game industry's collapse than anything else. And at the time, No Puzzles Either was panned for its shameless microtransactions. One review I found is someone saying they wished the £7 bottomless pickaxe was a given and the game was made a paid product. And I personally agree. Back when it was the current game, I actually did buy the full version of No Puzzles Either to try it out. And now it's a game I'm one monster away from 100%ing. And I still come back to it from time to time. While one of the earlier scummy freemium games, I give No Puzzles Either credit for having some legitimately good gameplay under all the slime. The problem is, well, these weren't just spin-offs. They were a stark change in the game's identity, something that has stuck to this day. In 2017, we see a glimmer of a return to form for the Badman franchise, with No Heroes Allowed VR being released. I actually got hold of this game recently after a long period of trying to even afford it and a PSVR, and I found it to be pretty enjoyable, albeit a bit short. It changes monsters quite a bit and streamlines the gameplay of the dungeon building titles, taking on a grand strategy style play like Europa of the Universalists in a cosmic sort of way. In general though, it felt more like an experimental VR title than anything, not really incorporating the headset at all, and having a gameplay loop that felt very watered down. There was still comparable depth, and the same humour was there, but it tended to be a bit more snowbally, and some mechanics, particularly those centered around rune-born monsters, were clearly not balanced. You can really just build up a high grade one and win. I was left wanting more, especially in the challenge department, which is a very good sign of something great, especially for someone like me who typically finds it hard to get into games nowadays. Due to its uninspiring sales numbers, in part due to the PlayStation VR itself, I have to wonder if this will ever be revisited. I think the core issue is that it had been 7 years since the last title was about building a horde. This just wasn't what the series needed, and at any other time, it would have been fine. It probably wasn't meant to be. In 2018, Yusha no Kusei ni Konomaki da Dash would release, or Yusha Dash for short. Like No Puzzles Either, it was a sliding puzzle style game, but this time exclusively for Android devices, and it was also only in Japan. However, it was worse. Unlike No Puzzles Either, it was wholly a gacha title, completely mask off, completely shameless. It included many new monsters, and even had some collaborations with franchises like Mega Man, which I can appreciate, but no. It didn't consider the redesigns the VR title brought, and instead acted as if it never existed. Gacha games, especially ones like this, are just cash grabs. Cash grabs that manipulate the mentally vulnerable into spending what they don't have in order to get anywhere in the game. Otherwise, they risk falling behind further and further, constantly having their assets power crept to force more spending. This game truly was like that. I could go on, but I'd be here all day. Like many of the gacha titles of the time period, however, this embarrassment will only live for a year, its servers dying in April 2019, just shy of the franchise's 10th anniversary, with zero preservation efforts made, and money likely not being funneled back into the franchise. Corporate pump and dump scheme much? And that brings us to today. At the time of this video's production, it has been 13 years since the first No Heroes Allowed title was released, and 12 since we've seen a title like the original 3. 5 if you count the VR title. It saddens me to see this series become what it is today, seemingly coasting off its old legacy without any attention being given to the original genre that had built it up. I usually don't have a problem with things like this, reimagining things is important, and I even enjoy the puzzle games from time to time, in spite of what they symbolise. But the lack of a mainline, familiar title in the old style for over a decade really makes me wonder what's in store for this obscure franchise. There's clearly something here, something that in another universe could have been a sprawling IP, but we're stuck here. The newest title is defunct, the VR game is exceedingly rare, and PSP games are being phased out of the PlayStation Store entirely, only being accessible on the Vita and PS3 now. Soon, the vast majority of this franchise will not be accessible, with only like sporadic physical releases of some games being around, but even that's like not applying to everything. I dread to think what would happen in the next 5 years with this franchise, really. Anyway, in my spare time, for about a year now, I've actually been working on an old wiki to help make the franchise more accessible. If you're interested, I'll leave a link to that and its Discord server. I'd love to find people who used to play these games, or even get others into it. These games are really cool and warrant serious preservation efforts. This was Spike Von Karma, and I'll see you all next time.